Hi guys, Frankie B from Frozen Sand with a continuation of our retro mapping project here of converting Turnpike over to an Unreal 4 map based on a 100% accurate reference pulled from the pulled from the BSP and demonstrating my workflow of how I go about managing a huge amount of content in a very small amount of space as far as workflow goes. Now, in our last episode, I covered an overview of how I set things up as far as knolling the map into a usable type of configuration that and break it down into much more manageable bite-sized pieces as far as the total volume of assets goes. It's kind of like breaking the forest down into individual trees so we can focus on the tree and not the entire project as one big chunk of data. So continuing on with our knolling process, I have gone ahead and consolidated everything down into smaller, more manageable blocks based on the item within 3D space, which I kind of demonstrated before, and then assign them a name, a simple naming convention. In this case, block 19 versus block 18 versus map objects, like for example, things that are going to be instant copy later on down the road. But stuff that is desirable to have in place as to using them as placement references. Like here's the vehicles. There's one. There's one. There's one. And then of course there's kind of like a trailer house over here on the outside of the fence. And this gives us a better overview of any and all of the total problems with the initial BSP extraction. That makes it not a very good idea just to take a BSP conversion and dump it straight into Unreal 4 and say, ta-da, I got a map ready to rock and roll. It just unfortunately doesn't work that easily based on the different requirements between an IDTech 3 map versus an Unreal 4 map. So now we have things kind of much better laid out in any kind of editing application you wish to use. This will work the same way in Blender, just as easy as it would in a high-powered and, of course, expensive application like 3ds Max or Maya. The only real requirement is being able to put stuff into some sort of manageable type of selection as to individual items rather than having the entire map. That's I think I already did this in the other episode, but let's do let's unhide all so we can take a look at what we got. Come on! Oh, I hit the wrong one, didn't I? Unreal, yes. Okay, let's unhide all. And so, ta-da! Each of these, so we have a way to be able to identify individual blocks within 3D space. So, for example, this here as a block, you see that they're all the items as far as our need for reference concerned is has been assigned as block 11. So we have the ability to keep track and create a asset chain from 3ds Max into Unreal 4 and be able to identify this as an object. Now it should be noted that your unit's configuration should be set up for world space units that matches Unreal 4. So in this case, my system unit setup is 1 unit equals 1 centimeter. So it's a 100% match as far as relative scaling goes between 3ds Max and Unreal 4. And we're all happy with the idea that this block 11 is being edited in place and is located exactly where it would be located in once we move it over into Unreal 4 as done via FBX export selected, and we create a file to contain that block 11, and we'll go ahead and go OK, and then we can import this block into Unreal 4 and then put it into its proper position relative to its world space. We now have a means of being able to further iterate this particular model as we make modifications. So let's say we need the roof to be a bit higher here. We go, okay, we're done. Okay, and we can then once again do a export selected, and instead of creating a new file, we just take our block 11 in here, hit the save button, say yes, and okay, and our file is updated so that when we re-import this over into Unreal 4, ta-da, the edits that we made to this block has been established. We can actually totally 100% swap this out for extremely highly detailed model if we wish, and it will obviously be relayed over to our project, our Turnpike project, as part of the iteration process. So I think we have kind of everything set up. So what I've gone ahead and done was instead of individual blocks, because we're only using these items for reference as to maintaining, let's say, the faith and being faithful to a retro mapping of Turnpike for the purpose of playing it in Resurgence, the next iteration of Urban Terror. And our desire is to maintain as much of the original fabric of the map as possible that has made it popular in the first place. You know, we don't want to weed out the popularity of the map, obviously, by making too much intuitive changes. But, well, the way I look at it is we're not really map making. We already have a map. So what we're doing is we're retro mapping. It's a better word. I feel a lot more comfortable with it because I'm not map making. I'm using somebody else's art that they are entitled to maintain credit. It's kind of like fixing up an old Ford Shelby, giving it a paint job, an interior, new custom interior, clean interior, bringing it back to showroom condition. But doing so does not give me the right to call it a Frankie Ford, for example. It's still a Shelby Ford, and we want to maintain that connectivity to the original artist as they do deserve that as a credit. So I just thought to point that out, that, well, for one thing, from an artistic standpoint, stealing somebody else's work and claiming it as your own is a big no-no. You're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble if you say, hey, I made this map and it's called Turnpike. You're not going to get away with that. Okay, so anyways, to make things easier, instead of doing individual block layouts, which is going to be reserved for when we actually get into blocking in the facade elements, which is, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on that when we get there. I've gone ahead and just exported everything out as far as what I need as reference has been put into place into Unreal 4 based on, let's say, logic blocks, knowing, back to the Lego terminology, of having things sorted out at 90-degree angles in a logical order of progression that we can just later on start breaking things down. So, for example, I have 45 odd blocks after that process, which I then brought into Unreal 4 under my reference objects folder here. So these are all the blocks that make up this map. I also have doors separated. There's a logic as to the reason for doing it this way too as well. Fences have been brought in. Ground plane, which is going to be dealt with. Well, the thing is that the most important element that you would need first in any map development is a ground, because the natural state of Unreal 4 is the physics of the player always in a state of falling, meaning that the player will continue to fall through the map until it hits a surface that has collision, and which will support I guess you could say, their weight in a way. So you can kind of run around and take a look at what's going on. And of course, At this stage, since we have all this in here, it gives us the opportunity to actually look at what we're doing as a combined total, but still segmented into much more manageable sections that we can include or exclude as progression goes. So this is the let's say the finalization of knolling the map into a manageable, a much more manageable project, and it would be the process if I had started from scratch and created all these buildings and layout and everything in place, as far as working within 3ds Max, creating a source chain between 3ds Max that brings the asset into Unreal 4, which is easy as easy as can be to iterate the various elements within this space here as to individual development. So for example, here's our block 11, which is stored in blocks, which creates a source chain directly connected to this, which I can select by renaming the pathway to the asset. Is no longer contained within a single FBX file as to how I export it. As I said, tried to mention, I took all the things that were marked as blocks and exported it by selection as a single package, imported everything as part of that, connected to that as part of that package into Unreal 4, and then it's drag and drop into place. So everything that I'm doing here is managed as a single package rather than individual elements that need any kind of special attention. I also gone ahead and broke out things like doors. Now this is going to become a little bit, why we did this way is going to become a lot more apparent as we work along. Let's hit the stop button here. It's going to become a lot more apparent as we work along and actually start developing this environment as a sequence, as a progression, rather than how I usually do things, which is usually each item at individual time. Now the next step that I would do before bringing everything into it, of course, is to create a blank project. The project would have nothing in it that is of relevance to anything that I want to do here. Later on down the road, as I mentioned, as we progress, we're going to get a little bit more advanced through progression as to the complexity of this project. Not we're doing everything one little piece at a time, rather than my normal workflow, which is rather messy, shall we say. But because of the knolling and process, everything is kept in a logical manner. So starting from scratch kind of idea, a blank project is a good place to start. And then what you do is you create a simple map. Like you go file, new level, and I start with a default map, the VR basic. Well, we're not dealing with VR. It has things that are VR related, which kind of messes things up. And I bring that in. And then one other thing I do is based on our progression of Unreal of Urban Terror as to the requirements of the game engine, as that's to switch over to forward rendering, which is not on by default. So I'm mentioning in that now, which if you are making a map, you got to kind of take on the risk that we might change that again. But in all theory, what I try to do is maintain the idea that a map is a map, and we just put in what's necessary down the road for what is required. So this is where level streaming comes in handy, and we can segment our things down and then kick things out that are no longer relevant and replace that. So the first thing I do is just grab everything in the new map level, as they only relate to the requirement of some sort of collision object that the player can fall onto, a start point, which I first immediately toss out because I want to be able to spawn anywhere in the map, and then take everything else and put it into a streaming map level as under supported levels. And there's our master lighting, which I then put in as a streaming level, and then switch the streaming method from blueprint to always loaded. So everything becomes segmented down into individual packages as far as ongoing iteration process goes. And then everything else is stored under as a support. These others is supported under reference. So these eventually will be kicked out, tossed away as they're replaced by better and better, and of course FS known elements as part of this conversion process. So I think that's all we need to cover as far as the knolling process goes. But as I mentioned, it gives us the opportunity to see, to kind of zoom around, get a sense of the overall construction of the original, to see how various inner elements have been added as they interconnect and become let's say an integral part of the overall map design. So for example, vehicles. We have a vehicle here which I replaced with some sort of Humvee or some sort of troop carrier, which kind of fits in with the theme of urban terror, but in the process I kind of broke the somewhat the fabric of the original design and the design of the map. So, and then when you start talking to like jumpers, of course, this could be breaking a fundamental need for being able to jump this map by putting a much larger object in its place. Something simple like a mailbox or a trash can being located at XYZ, or a tree that's too tall or too short or what have you, can have a rather devastating effect on another let's say sub-community as part of the urban terror environment. So jumpers are kind of like they're kind of took what they were given, and then they made their own type of gaming type around what was made available. So obviously we want to be able to have a consideration for what they want, not just what we feel that we can arbitrarily change as part of the ongoing process. The other benefit to this, of course, is as you saw, there is a ton of map objects that are associated. There's pretty close to 2,000. So a lot of those map objects are a repetition of a single object. So we can take like maybe 300 lights, which these are obviously what these represent, and replace those all with a instant copy of it. So in actuality, we are increasing the amount of detail, but by instancing, we actually decrease the amount of map loading as to content and keep the efficiency and the performance level at to maximum height. The same thing with the blocks here too as well. It gives you a chance to, especially on the 3ds Max side of things, to actually take a closer look at the construction. And a lot of times you'll see that, in my experience anyways, the amount of geometry actually being used that will be replaced by a facade is actually greater because of the use of brushes than it would be if we replaced it with simplified geometry to represent the same amount of surface area. So I'm looking at about 50K of worth of build assets. So by just instant copying and putting in clean geometry, we're actually decreasing the amount of geometry that's actually involved with this, making it a much more efficient map than it would have been originally in IdTech 3/URT. Now, I've actually proven myself to this as being fact because I've made a fair number of test maps under IdTech 3 just to kind of prove out fact and concept. And it's a given that in IdTech 3, if you switch from using brushes to practical geometry and then use simplified collision, the actual performance of the map increases substantially, that it makes it worth the effort. The same idea as switching to forward rendering is actually we found increases the frame rate substantially. I mean, we're not talking about 1 or 2 frame rates difference. We're talking in the neighborhood of about 40 to 50 frames per second difference between forward rendering and the stock rendering system that we are currently using, or did use as part of our ongoing development. Okay, I think I've more or less covered everything that I wanted to cover. There's one more thing. Oh, the last thing I wanted to cover was just to point it out quickly, because it's part of this process. Is initially we want to be able to run around the environment, even if we gray boxed it. I'll do a series on gray boxing later down the road, but I felt that it's important. The important part is the source chain, and being able to have stuff go out of one application into the other, and doing it in a manner that that is not overwhelming as to the idea of the forest for the trees kind of thing. But we want to be able to, at times, be able to test what we got. So we can go ahead, as I mentioned, the most important thing, of course, is to establish your ground as to referencing the player. So that would include things like inside a building. Our ground is going to be handled and managed in a different manner than we would, say, a ceiling or a roof, as far as the need for collision goes. To get, and there's, as I mentioned, we'll be doing an entire section on collision alone. So, but to get kind of into it, what you can do is you can select your static mesh. I have that separated because it's so important. I have ground usually separated into a separate folder. Double click on that and bring that up, and actually I think I can do that now in the actual details panels. You know, the nice thing about this process too as well, gives you an opportunity to kind of see if there has been any ongoing updates as to being able to make changes directly using the selection of it. Collision change setup on no, not in the details panel, but we can go over to and our editor view here and go down to collision, reduction setup. They always seem to change things as soon as you figure out where things are. They move things around. So you're going to have to kind of excuse me while I figure out where they put this. Okay, project default. Use complex collision as simple. That should do the trick. We now have collision on our object, and you can usually test that out by using that. There we go. And it seems to indicate that we have collision. Did they actually change that mode? Collision preset. I seem to recall. Yeah, you know, I'm pretty sure it's probably there. I've just recently bumped to 19, which usually means that stuff has been moved. But we'll go ahead and hit play. Nothing's happened. Okay, we're going to go play in selected viewport. Nothing happened. Why is that? Because, as I mentioned, it's best to always start with a blank project so you can see what's where and how it's laid out. And of course you have a blank content folder, so you're not dealing with inherited problems that are associated during the initial setup phase. But what we can do is we can go add new, add feature or content, and Urban Terror is a first person, but we need to add third person to the project so we can kind of make sure our collision and we can run around is all kind of set up. So now if we go hit play, still nothing happens. We go over to world setting and we go to game mode override. There's our third person template, and we hit play, and voila, and you can see that we can indeed run around on our map using our initially established ground plane. Oh, no collision there, of course, no collision in the fence. And then of course if you're going to run into a building, eventually you're going to run out of ground and fall into open space. We go over here, we run, whoops, there we go. So we've established that as our first setup. Now let's add in the first person perspective. So we have a package that conforms to both first and third person configurations. And we hit play. And oops. And we go over to our world settings and we change our third person to, oh come on, where are you? Non-game mode rendered texture third person. Maybe I didn't add it. Okay, add new, add features, first person, add to project. You probably, I'm going to have to okay, there it is. I probably best re-added the third person again. Oh well. First person, and we hit play, and there's our first person. So we have the means of being able to establish not only a logic block of buildings that they're going to be at this stage represent a means to being able to directly reference off the original, and we can see the natural progression. This is what we were lacking with the original conversion of Turnpike, was a highly accurate reference. Like you could export the shell, but you would start losing stuff like map. It didn't. The process that was available at the time didn't extract the map models, the ASE map models. The current available tools allow you to do that. All we need is the reference as to where things are placed, even if it looks ratty. See here, I kind of lost a section of the building, and we can run around. We can change. If we wanted to back to our third person, we hit play, and we can see how big our, keep it in mind, once again, our character is 6'3". We can make it, our player models are 6 foot, so if we wanted to, we can actually make the epic character 6 footed by just rescaling it. The character blueprint, you can make it as big as small as you want to. And just to kind of have a little bit more fun, we'll add a dune buggy. So if, say for example, we decide, hey, let's add vehicles. Whoops. Let's add vehicles to the mix. So we got vehicle, game mode, and we kind of boogie around our map using you could even, if you wish, let's say you have a bunch of guys that they want to test the playability of the map, you can just drag, once you start accumulating this up, that it starts becoming a little bit more collision and what have you, and you can move it over into another template. In this case, you can move it over into the shooter, which is what we based Urban Terror, the initial framework on, and play against bots, or it has some means of network connectivity. You can play with your map with buddies. You can move this over into Unreal Tournament and use that as a base. You can use any of the blueprint templates that are available on the marketplace. Like for example, the ladder climbing is actually bound to the game engine as an entity, as a physics material which you can preset up, but to be able to test it, you can use the ladder blueprint to test it, and then just change the game mode to whatever it is that you wish. Okay, I think that is about as much as I want to cover as far as Knolling goes, about setting things up so that we're at this stage where we can actually see, hey, this is looking, even as a straight one-to-one conversion, this is looking pretty darn good. This is, except for improved lighting, this is what Turnpike looks like. We're not having to deal with measuring tapes or guessing at the differences between the two files. And and as you can tell, I'm a much more happy camper about staging this as a map that will be in Resurgence, and not something that that now is going to be forked out as a project onto its own with different concepts and what requirements is, and then give the community the type of Turnpike map that they deserve, and will obviously, hopefully, continue to play and not land up in a bit bucket somewhere because I made a poor decision. Okay, guys, we'll see you in the next one. Now, for the next episode, I can either go with covering collision, or start working on the facade, the idea of setting up facades and setting up an iteration pipeline and demonstrating how that's done. So I'll decide somewhere along the line which way I want to go. Dealing with collision, of course, is obviously rather critical, so I might do that next. So so that we can then progress with the actually running around this map in a much, let's say, more game-ish type nature. So, for example, why it's set up this way initially is if we go ahead and because these are saved out as individual files, I'll deal with that down the road. That's a totally different type of subject that we're going to turn this into a 3-hour video, and I don't want to do that. But we can change the streaming method at any time we want from always loaded to blueprints. This is why I prefer this method over just using layers, because well, as I said, I'll go into the why and what fors, but the result is this, that by changing the streaming method, we get rid of the doors, which have to be blueprinted and have special wiring up and what have you. But once we have collision in place, we can then exclude the doors, so we can run into the buildings without having to actually spawn inside them, because they're in the way. They're not active yet. So same thing with Windows. Windows are going to be instant copy to decrease the count, and I have a window BP that I made up for one of my maps. Can't remember off the top of my head. I've done so much that I kind of forget. I've used my window BP on a few occasions, that you can change the mapping of the window itself, but you can add a transparency where you can kind of see into it. I actually stole that from another map, and obviously I'll point that out where things came from when we get there. Okay, we're getting into rambling on mode, and I'm hoping that this is under a half an hour. So we'll call this section done. If there's something I kind of overlooked, by all means mention it. If we get enough questions ongoing, I'll keep a section free and available so that we can answer those and keep things up to date, kind of idea. As I mentioned, I'm getting into rambling on mode, so let's call this episode done and move on to the next one.